As you know, this past weekend we've had two mass shootings. One took place at a supermarket in Buffalo, another took place at a church in Orange County, California. Not too surprisingly, out came the systemic race guard. We'll talk about that later on. And also out came the assertion that it's white males that are terrorizing America. Never mind that when you look at the percentage of white males in our population, the numbers of white males who commit mass killings, mass shootings, are actually underrepresented. And when you look at the percentage of black males in our country, and almost all these mass shootings and mass killings are conducted by men, black men and Asian men are actually overrepresented. My guest is John Lott. John Lott is with the Crime Research Prevention Center, author of the book More Guns, Less Crime. John, thank you very much for taking the time. What do we know about the Buffalo shooter first?
Well, we know he spent a lot of time planning this. We know that this guy basically had to deal with all the different types of gun control laws in New York. I mean, one of the things, both of these shootings in New York and California, they have all the gun control laws that any of the Democrats have claimed that we need in order to go and stop these attacks. And yet we had two of those attacks there, whether it be an assault weapons ban or whether it be background checks on the private transfers of guns or other types of restrictions there. And yet they still conducted both of these attacks. In fact, the one in New York, he actually used some machine tools to take what was a New York State compliant gun and turn it into kind of a more traditional AR-15 simply to try to irritate people. But the amazing thing to me is just what was in his manifesto. This individual spent a fair amount of time, obviously planning the attack. He visited there beforehand to scope it out. But when you read his manifesto, he talks about trying to find places where he doesn't think people will have concealed carry permits, either because they're banned or because very few are given out, because you know it's going to be much easier to go and do the attack. There was a security guard at the grocery store, but the problem I don't think most people understand is if you have one person there in uniform, they have an incredibly difficult job in order to try to stop these attacks. They stand out, easily identifiable. If the killer believes that they're the only person there that's going to have a gun, then they know if they take that person out, they're going to have free reign. So who do you think they pin down first there to try to make sure they're not going to be able to go and do anything? New York currently has a case before the U.S. Supreme Court on their concealed carry laws that are there. They're very restrictive. Only about 1% of adults any place in the state of New York have a concealed carry permit. In urban areas, it's actually relatively lower. And on top of that, we're talking about a fairly hefty cost compared to most places for getting a concealed carry permit. So in the type of lower income minority area where this attack occurred, they're going to be even much lower than the 1% rate for the state as a whole. So this guy, in terms of talking about trying to find targets where he knows people can't defend themselves, obviously he's thought through a lot of these things. To me, one of the more amazing things over the last couple of days has been the media rhetoric on right-wingers and kind of blaming everybody from Newt Gingrich to Trump to Elena Stefanik, a congresswoman from New York, for kind of the ideological underpinnings of this attack. And the New York Times was amazing, blaming Newt and Stefanik for the attack. I don't know if these guys actually read it. This guy describes himself as a left-wing socialist, eco-terrorist type. He explains that the reason why he dislikes minorities is because he believes that they tend to have children at relatively high rates, and that we need to cut down on the population because having more people in the world damages the environment. Is that an argument you've heard made by Newt Gingrich very many times? I don't think so. I don't know any prominent Republican who are making that. On the other hand, I know people like AOC has gone and talked about whether people even morally should have kids. But that's, again, and the other thing is all the rhetoric on the Democratic side about the risk that we face to the world in terms of pollution, in terms of population. Here we have an 18-year-old who may have been radicalized. And, if I honestly believed that the fate of mankind was greatly endangered, if I was a young person, I might do something really stupid if I really believe the type of radical rhetoric that this guy seems to believe.
John, it sounds like he might be listening more to Greta Thunberg than to Rush Limbaugh or Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham. A reporter from CBS, his name is Wesley Lowry, argued that this guy's manifesto could have been written by Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham. He sounds to me like he's more likely to have been watching MSNBC Hee Haw rather than Fox News. Let's talk, John, about the man suspected of the mass shooting at the Orange County church here in California, a state that's got the most restrictive gun laws than any of the other 49 states. What do we know about him?
I don't know as much about him. I haven't been able to look into it carefully. I've been mainly looking at the one in New York. But look, California issues very few concealed handgun permits. You're banned on city places to be able to go and take it. California will also be affected by the Supreme Court decision that's coming up in the gun case. And, it's amazing how New York, they're already calling for more gun control laws. To me, often the problem is that you disarm people. You make it so that the law-abiding citizens are the ones who obey these laws, not the criminals. And to the extent that you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you actually make it easier for the criminals to go and commit these types of heinous crimes. I understand the desire that people have to go and create gun-free zones, but the problem is if you're primarily going to have law-abiding citizens who obey those rules relative to criminals, you actually create magnets for these types of attacks. There's a reason why since 1950, about 94% of the mass public shootings have taken place in those areas where concealed handguns are banned by civilians. Even if you have a security guard, as was just seen in New York, I wish people would understand the tremendously difficult job. If you have concealed carry permits, you actually make the job of the officer or a security guard much easier, because the attacker then has to realize that when he pulls out his gun and starts to go after the uniformed person with a gun, he has to realize that there may be somebody behind him or to the side who might be able to go and stop him. And that makes their job much riskier.
John, let's talk a little bit about this rhetoric, the epidemic of white supremacist killers stalking America. I'm looking at some numbers, and white males, and almost all these shootings and killings are done by men. White males represent roughly 63% of the male population, but have committed in the last 20 years or so 54% of these mass shootings and mass killings. In other words, they are underrepresented when compared to the percentage of the population. On the other hand, Black males are roughly 12.3% of the population, but roughly 17.5% of these mass shootings, mass killings have been done by white males, and similar numbers regarding Asian. Asian males are roughly 3.6 or so of the population, but in the last 20 years have committed about 6.6 percentage of these mass shootings and mass killings. So if anything, these so-called people of color, close quote, are overrepresented when it comes to mass shootings and mass killings, but white men are underrepresented.
Right. You would think that they would adjust for the shares of the population to see whether or not particular groups are, greater threat than others. I mean, obviously it doesn't fit in with Biden administration push on white supremacists that they're going to be going after. my research, I find about 9% of the mass public shooters since 1998 have in any way been associated with neo-Nazi, white supremacists, anti-immigration, which is a pretty broad category, or other similar types of things. Muslims make up essentially the exact same percentage of mass public shooters. Muslims make up about 0.4% of the US population. So they're way overrepresented. I'm not trying to go and single out any particular group. I'm just saying that if you're going to go and try to demonize certain groups, at least try to put, take into account their shares of the population when you're doing it. But one of the interesting things to me has been it's just not Biden going after, but entertainment television. You watch CBS, all sorts of cop shows from SWAT and other things on CBS. Their big boogeymen over the last couple of years has been white supremacists going and doing mass public shootings. And, it's, I don't know, I suppose they want to go and demonize something there, but, I'm not sure other than politically, what's the point of doing that?
No, in fact, John, the producer of Cops once publicly said that he overrepresents white criminals and underrepresents Black criminals because he does not want to, quote, perpetuate the stereotype, close quote. In other words, he does not want his show to reflect the truth about who's committing crime in America. And John, when it comes to things like admissions into colleges, the percentage of Blacks who are behind bars, poverty, the percentage of Black head coaches in the NFL, the percentage of Black nominees and winners for the Academy Awards, we're always being told about underrepresentation. But when it comes to the percentage of people who are killing, who are engaging in mass shootings and mass killings, all of a sudden, overrepresentation is something they don't want to talk about.
Right. Well, things like the lack of success for many young people, you and I would both agree. You want to move away from single parent families. You want to have more competition in terms of schooling that's there, have vouchers, have, the worst performing schools are in these heavily minority areas. And, it's real damage to people's future lives if they're not getting the proper education. We're not, we wouldn't want to just have one car company for the government producing cars or computers or something like that. Why do we want to give them a monopoly, essentially, on something as important as education?
Absolutely. Now, John, for the last part of our interview, let's talk about the number of people who use guns for defensive purposes, many of whom would be dead but for the firing arm. You and I have talked about this over the years. I'm always amazed whenever something like this happens in Orange County and in Buffalo, how there is rarely, if ever, a discussion about how often Americans use guns to defend themselves. Even on Fox News, even in conservative outlets, you almost never hear this brought up. What's the truth? How often do Americans use firearms every year to defend themselves? And out of that percentage of Americans who use firearms to defend themselves, how many of them would have been seriously injured, if not dead?
Sure. Well, I've been very disappointed with Fox's news coverage over the last couple of days with regard to the shooting in New York. But look, if people watch the news media generally, they would think defensive gun uses virtually never occur. And they would think that when they do occur, they often go wrong. This last year, I looked at the 5 largest newspapers in the United States, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal. I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 2,300 news stories about gun crimes that had occurred. Those 5 newspapers together had a total of 10 stories on defensive gun uses. And a number of those, about half of them, had something go wrong with it. The wrong person was shot when the person tried to use a gun defensively. So, and CNN and MSNBC, if you watch those religiously, you wouldn't have seen one single defensive gun use story being covered. And so somebody could think that they're very well read, that they keep up with the news, And their assumption would be defensive gun uses virtually never occur, and to the extent that they do occur, something goes wrong. You know, I can understand some of this in terms of what's, quote, newsworthy versus what we should know in order to make policy judgments. You know, if you have two stories, and in one case, a woman uses a gun defensively, brandishes it, the criminal runs away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, you're not even sure what crimes committed, versus another case where, let's say, you have a dead body on the ground, a sympathetic person like a victim. I think you or I or just about anybody else who's an editor at that point would pick the second story as being more newsworthy than the first story. But just because something's newsworthy, it's not necessarily giving you an accurate perception of what we care about in terms of evaluating policy. And what you find in any given year, you'll find about 2,000 news stories about defensive gun uses in all sorts of media across the country. Just to give you an idea of how kind of lopsided the coverage is, the majority of those stories involve instances when the criminal's been killed. Most of the rest involve instances where the criminal's been seriously wounded. And you have about 4% involve some type of brandishing, and most of those are when the person's been held at gunpoint until the police arrive.
Right.
That's kind of the exact opposite of what we know happens in the real world. About 95% of the time people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is sufficient to cause a criminal to break off an attack. Less than 1 out of every 1,000 times that people use guns defensively is the criminal kill. And so, you know, it's what makes it newsworthy, gets the attention there. And that's, you know, a very kind of excellent example of how misrepresented the news are there. Because you're going to think not only are defensive gun uses rare, but you're going to think when people use them, usually somebody's going to get killed. And that's
Right.
simply not the case.
John, I interviewed Gary, a criminologist in Florida. This is some years ago. He told me that about 1.25 million Americans every year use guns for defensive purposes. Again, about 90% of the time just brandishing the gun. And out of that number, about 40% believe but for the firearm, they would have been dead. Now you're talking about 30,000 people who are killed by handguns every year. Half of those are suicides. We're talking about 15,000 non-suicides versus hundreds of thousands of uses of guns for defensive purposes, where the person using the gun believes that he or she would be dead or would have suffered serious bodily injury.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to have to go. But the, you know, look, I think the average estimate for the surveys is about 2 million defensive gun uses a year.
Right.
And, you know, it's a pretty big difference that you have there. So,
John Lott, Crime Prevention Research Center, as always. John, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. Now, after the mass murder of 10 people at that Buffalo supermarket, a reporter, and I put that in quotes, his name is Wesley Lowery, and according to Wikipedia, you know how reliable that is, he is with CBS and used to be with the Washington Post. So his left-wing bona fides are right there for you. Here is what Mr. Lowery said. Watch this.
Look, let's be clear. The stuff Tucker and Laura Ingraham say every night, it could be written by white supremacists very often. There is a section of this manifesto where the shooter starts talking about, people always say diversity is strength. How is it strength? I could hear it in Tucker's voice. He says this all the time, right? But the Ben Shapiro's of the world say this. There's a big chunk about the idea of genetic differences that could have been pulled from an Andrew Sullivan column, right? There are plenty of people in our politics, in our media, who advance these ideas and advance them frequently. But beyond that, though, I do think the point you're making here is right. We cannot simplify this specifically just to a specific network, even to specific online spaces. We have to have a conversation about our political rhetoric in our country, right?
Did he read the manifesto? In it, the man refers to himself as a left-wing eco-terrorist. Talks about the population proliferation of people of color. Talks about climate change. He could very easily have been a big fan of the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC Hall as opposed to Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham. And he says we should have a conversation about political rhetoric after having said that. Now, I mentioned reporter in quotes. Can you imagine back in the day? I'm old enough to remember when a reporter would never have said anything like that. Even Walter Cronkite, who was with CBS for years, turned out he was left-wing. Can you imagine Walter Cronkite going on television and saying, this sounds like it could have been written by and naming somebody like Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham who could have written this? This is just sick, absolutely sick. And the implication is that a bunch of white supremacists are running around mowing down people when the numbers say the opposite. For example, the following day, there was a mass shooting at an Orange County church. 1 person killed, 5 people injured. The suspect is alleged to be an Asian male in his 50s or in his 60s. Most of the churchgoers inside that church were of Taiwanese descent. We don't know much more about the shooter's ethnicity other than the reporters are saying that he's an Asian male. So does that really fit the script? And when it comes to mass killers, mass shooters, here's an October 2017 Newsweek headline: white men have committed more mass shootings than any other group. And here's what they say, and I'm quoting: the high number of white men committing mass shootings is also explained, and by the way, this is buried deeper into the article, at least in part by the fact that white people make up a majority of the US population, 63% male population, and white people make up the majority of the US population, 63%, and men are more likely to commit violent crime in general. Wait a minute, white male population, 63% of the male population, and white males commit 54% of mass shootings. So if anything, white males are, and to use a favorite word of the left, underrepresented when it comes to mass killings and mass shootings. PolitiFact, same year, 2017, said this, and I'm quoting: critics argue, by the way, critics argue, you mean critics put forth the fact? Critics argue that when you consider that non-Hispanic white men make up about 63% of the male population, white men appear proportionately less likely to commit a mass shooting, according to Mother Jones, showing white men account for 54% of mass shootings, end of quote. PolitiFact is left-wing, and Mother Jones is left-wing. And then there's UCLA professor Eugene Volokh. He wrote for Reason magazine, a libertarian magazine, and he looked at mass shootings, mass killings from 1982 to 2021. And he found that Blacks and Asians commit 17.4%, Blacks representing 12.3% of the population, and 6.6% Asian mass shootings, while representing 3.6% of the population. Volokh said this, and I'm quoting: non-Hispanic whites don't seem to commit mass shootings at a greater share than that of the population. The groups that appear overrepresented are Blacks and Asians, end of quote. How incredibly inconvenient. Now, when it comes to things like poverty, when it comes to things like getting into colleges and universities, when it comes to the percentage of Black men who are in prison, we're always talking about overrepresentation, underrepresentation, overrepresentation, underrepresentation. And when it comes to things like NFL head coaches, the percentage of people nominated for Academy Awards and winners of Academy Awards, the media and the left are all about Blacks being underrepresented, people of color being underrepresented. But when it comes to Blacks and Asians, as to mass shooters and mass killers, the fact that they're overrepresented, all of a sudden, nobody seems to give a rip. Now let's talk about the way the media covers these kinds of things. Regarding the Buffalo killer, again, he posted 2 days before the shooting a very long manifesto, had all sorts of racist things in the manifesto. Although, as I said, he described himself as a left-wing eco-terrorist. That's a little inconvenient. Let's put that to the side. Headline, Sunday LA Times, mass shooting in Buffalo is called a racist hate crime. LA Times. News for Buffalo. Buffalo mass shooters alleged manifesto leaves no doubt attack was white supremacist terrorism. Al Jazeera, 10 killed in racially motivated shooting in Buffalo. Al Jazeera. NBC News, 10 killed, 3 wounded in racist shooting at Buffalo supermarket, officials say. CNN, Buffalo shooting, 10 people killed in a racially motivated mass shooting. No question, racially motivated. The BBC, 10 dead in suspected race attack at New York State store. Again, BBC News. Now, you remember the man who got in his van and mowed down all those people at that Christmas gathering in Waukesha in late November last year? Posted on his Facebook page, urged violence against whites, praised Hitler, was a proponent of Black Lives Matter. Headline, New York Times, 5 dead in Wisconsin after driver plows SUV into holiday parade. Notice anything missing? Nothing about it being racially motivated. Again, Facebook post urging violence against white people. Here's Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Waukesha Christmas parade began as a festive event. Then screaming began and things went very wrong. Not one word mentioned about a racial motivation by the guy in the van, Black man, Darrell Brooks. Another Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel headline, driver plows into Waukesha Christmas parade crowd, leaving 5 dead. By the way, ultimately 6 died. More than 40 injured. Not one word about it being racially motivated. And then later on, a couple of days later, the New York Times, what we know and don't know about the Wisconsin parade attack. And then it says, quote, suspects' motivations are unclear in a tragedy that left 6 people dead and dozens more injured during a Christmas parade in Waukesha. We don't know about his motive. Never mind what he wrote on Facebook. White people need to be killed. White people need to be murdered. White people need to be attacked. But we don't know the motive. Notice pattern here? When it comes to the white man killing all those people in Buffalo, no question what his motive is. And indeed, he did put out this racist manifesto. But on the Facebook page of Darrell Brooks, the suspect in the Waukesha killings, mass killings, the driver of the SUV, he made it clear how he felt about white people, yet his motives are unclear, says the New York Times. This is the double standard that I'm talking about. Now, let's talk about Kamala Harris. She is in mid-season form. How many times is she going to say we need to work together? Watch this.
I've often known and have talked with many of you about our shared belief that our world is increasingly more interconnected and interdependent. That is especially true when it comes to the climate crisis, which is why we will work together and continue to work together to address these issues, to tackle these challenges, and to work together as we continue to work operating from the new norms, rules, and agreements that we will convene to work together on to galvanize global action. With that, I thank you all This is a matter of
Man.
urgent priority for all of us. And
I
know
haven't
we will
heard
work on
anybody
this
repeat a phrase like that
So with
since
that,
Allen
thank you, and
Iverson
to the
said
members-
about practice. Practice, practice, practice. We're going to work together. We need to work together. We need to work together. We need to convene ourselves and work together. Mr. C, can I hear that one more time? Kamala Harris in mid-season form.
I often note and have talked with many of you about our shared belief that our world is increasingly more interconnected and interdependent. That is especially true when it comes to the climate crisis, which is why we will work together and continue to work together to address these issues, to tackle these challenges, and to work together as we continue to work operating from the new norms, rules, and agreements that we will convene to work together on to galvanize global action. With that, I thank you all. This is a matter of urgent priority for all of us, and I know we will work on this together. So with that, thank you. And to the members of the press, thank you all. We're going to now begin our conversation.
I think I counted 6 works-togethers. Might have been 5.5. She caught herself. She almost did another one. I think it was a good 6. By the way, Darrell Brooks, the Waukesha driver that plowed through all those people, to my knowledge, he's not even been charged with a hate crime, even though his Facebook page said, so when we start back knocking white people, TF out. I don't want to hear the old white people. Knock them TF out. Big letters, 2 exclamation points, period. He wrote under his rap name along with a middle finger emoji. But the man has not been charged with a hate crime. Now, there's a very entertaining TikTok video of a woman explaining exactly how insane wokeism has become. Let's take a listen.
I never dreamed that I would have to face the prospect of not living in the United States of America, at least not the one I've known all my life. I've never wished to live anywhere else. This is my home, and I was privileged to be born here. But today I woke up, and as I had my morning coffee, I realized that everything is about to change. No matter how I vote, no matter what, I say something evil has invaded our nation, and our lives are never going to be the same. I've been confused by the hostility of family and friends. I look at people I've known all my life, so hate-filled that they agree with opinions they would never express as their own. I think I may have, entered the twilight zone. We become a nation that has lost its collective mind. You can't justify this insanity. If a guy pretends to be a woman, you're required to pretend with him. Somehow, it's un-American for the census to count how many Americans are in America. Russians influencing our elections are bad, but illegals voting in our elections are good. It was cool for Joe Biden to blackmail the president of Ukraine, but it's an impeachable offense if Donald Trump inquires about it. 20 is too young to drink a beer, but 18 is old enough to vote. People who have never owned slaves should pay slavery reparations to people who have never been slaves. People who have never been to college should pay the debts of college students who took out huge loans for their degrees. Immigrants with tuberculosis and polio are welcome, but you'd better be able to prove your dog is vaccinated. Irish doctors and German engineers who want to immigrate to the U.S. must go through a rigorous vetting process, but any illiterate gangbangers who jump the southern fence are welcome. $5 billion for border security is too expensive, but $1.5 trillion for free healthcare is not. If you cheat to get into college, you go to prison, but if you cheat to get into the country, you go to college for free. People who say there is no such thing as gender are demanding a female president. We see other countries going socialist and collapsing, but it seems like a great plan to us. Some people are held responsible for things that happened before they were born, and other people are not held responsible for what they're doing right now. Criminals are caught and released to hurt more people, but stopping them is bad because it's a violation of their rights. And pointing out all this hypocrisy somehow makes us racist. Nothing makes sense anymore. No values, no morals, and no civility. People are dying of a Chinese virus, but it's racist to refer to it as Chinese even though it began in China. We're clearly living in an upside-down world where right is wrong and wrong is right, where moral is immoral and immoral is moral, where good is evil and evil is good, where killing murderers is wrong but killing unborn babies is A-okay. Wake up, America. The great unsinkable ship, Titanic America, has hit an iceberg, is taking on water, and is sinking fast. Speak up.
which now brings us to election integrity. We've talked about the documentary that Dinesh D'Souza put together called 2,000 Mules. We looked at 5 battleground states. And these mules, these are people that are paid to stuff ballot boxes in these drop boxes, went in cities like Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, where there are a substantial amount of Democratic voters, many of whom are Black voters. And the attorneys general in those 5 states were asked about 2,000 mules. Only one attorney general responded. I guess the others are trying to figure out how they're going to justify videotape of people going from drop box to drop box to drop box within a matter of hours with a big stack of mail-in ballots, stuffing them, some of them even dropping them. There's so many of them. I guess some of the other attorneys general are trying to figure out how they're going to explain away that. But one from Michigan did respond. And it's the Michigan Secretary of State named Joycelyn Benson and the Michigan AG named Dana Nessel, Democrat, both Democrats, and the office of the Arizona AG, Republican, responded. Quote, a True the Vote study, this is from Epic Times, a True the Vote study found that in Wayne County, Michigan, at least 500 intermediaries called mules engaged in ballot trafficking by collecting thousands of absentee ballots from voters and depositing them in drop boxes for money. The clips involving Michigan have been shared with the department, but they're explained by standard election practices well within state and federal law. Dinesh D'Souza responded and said, I find the response quite shocking, as paid ballot trafficking is illegal in all 50 states. He said, how can they refuse to even investigate? Well, I guess the answer has to be that this is cheating that helps their party, end of quote. By the way, the documentary has now been seen by over 1 million people in less than 12 hours. It is now considered to be one of the most successful, if not the most successful, political documentary in the last 10 years. Real quickly, with our remaining time, just how badly are things going in Ukraine? Remember, one of the reasons that Putin used in invading this full-scale invasion of Ukraine is the fear that Ukraine may try to join NATO. Well, now, because of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, guess which countries now are very likely going to be admitted into NATO? Finland and Sweden, both of whom have assiduously avoided entry into NATO. But now, because of what Putin did, these countries have now said they want to join NATO, and NATO is more than happy to admit them. So the whole rationale, at least one of the big rationales behind invading Ukraine, is now blowing up in Putin's face big time. Furthermore, I have read that as much as 25% to a third of his troops are either dead, injured, or otherwise incapacitated. It has been an absolute total disaster for what was thought to be a 48, 72-hour successful campaign. And by the way, this is not yet another black eye on our intelligence establishment, because the consensus was that this full-scale invasion would cause Ukraine to fall within 48, 72 hours, just as our intelligence was wrong about the willingness of the Afghan military to stand up. They collapsed like a house of cards, just as our intelligence was wrong about the assertion that Saddam Hussein was going to have stockpiles of WMD. That turned out to be wrong. Isn't it incredible how often our military establishment is wrong about major events, wrong about major assumptions, wrong about Putin, wrong about Afghanistan, completely wrong about Saddam Hussein having stockpiles of WMD? I believe, by the way, the WMD was there and that he got rid of it in the 15-month run-up to the war. A top general in the army of Saddam Hussein, his name is George Asada, said he was involved in transporting the WMD out of Iraq and sent it to Syria under the ruse that they were engaging in some sort of humanitarian mission. So I believe the WMD were there, but the assumption was that when we went in there, we were going to find stockpiles of active WMD. That turned out to also have been wrong. So We covered a lot of ground today. We covered the mass shootings. We covered the assertion that these mass shooters are motivated by white supremacy. We covered the assertion that people like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham were inspiring these mass shooters. We talked about Kamala Harris being in mid-season form. We talked about the disaster on Putin's hands as to his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's enough for one day. I'm Larry Elder, and this has been the Larry Elder Show for Epic Times. I will see you next time.